Hey everyone, I'm Robert with AWS. I'm here in Boston today for Reinforce, the first ever. And I'm here with Merritt Baer, Principal Security Architect. Merritt, first off, you have the coolest name. But please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thank you. So my name is Merritt Baer. I'm a Principal Security Architect in Global Accounts, which is a lot of AWS's largest customers around the world, across a range of verticals from oil and gas to manufacturing, automotive, healthcare, pharma, et cetera. So I deal with customers tackling complex security and privacy and compliance issues every day. And my background, actually, I came from US government a little over a year ago. I was just talking to a colleague actually asking about, what the transition has been like. And I feel like, there's only a handful of places that you're really looking at landscape level security issues. US government was one, and Amazon is one as well, really looking at just large scale infrastructural security and what's on the landscape and how to raise that water level. So I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have somebody with your extensive background and experience. What's the favorite part of your job?
Oh gosh, I love the fact that hopefully the ROI of the time I spend is that I help make the world more secure. I think that for any of us to get out of bed in the morning, but especially for the work that we do to have meaning and for it to be worth it, and to the extent that no one has an unlimited well of time on Earth, the calculation of how to spend that life is, for me, weighed against the value proposition of the time I spend. So to the extent that I am helping customers not only to be more secure, but also to internally improve their mechanisms to scale, which of course is one of the value propositions of cloud in the first place, and something we'll talk about here today.
Yeah.
I see a lot of value for ways to accelerate your own impact in the world.
Yeah, and we're here to talk about DevSecOps, the DevSecOps model. So
Yes.
let's dive in. Tell us about what this is.
Yeah, so I know that DevSecOps is not a favorite term among a lot of folks, but like cyber, I don't know of a better one, so we're using it here today. And I think that there's a couple, justifications behind the reasoning for not liking the term. One is that it's just awkward, but the other is that, it implies that we're kind of inserting security into DevOps, which, could or ought to be a native part of what you're considering when your developers are doing operations anyway. And sure, I agree with that, but I think the intentionality of inserting sec into the phrase is to deliberately demonstrate that there is an intention there, that security is just part of the way you do business. And certainly it is true that at AWS we talk about security being job zero, but ultimately I think any sophisticated customer knows that you're not going to be able to build anything that your customers will use if they don't know that you can be secure. And we'll talk a little bit more about what DevSecOps means in terms of implementing it.
Yeah, and I think another reason why the word DevSecOps is so weird, not only because it's awkward to say, it's because inserting sec into DevOps, where DevOps was already a poorly defined term, right? DevOps was already this kind of means whatever you want it to mean kind of word. It lost a lot of its specificity over time. So just inserting security into that, I can kind of see where people are coming. But you're going to give us the definition, at least from your angle, right?
I'm going to talk a little bit about, it's kind of the duck test where if it walks like it and talks like it, then you probably can aspire at least to be doing it. And I think some of this will involve just the value proposition and why we bother. Why is this a good that we're leaning towards? So part of this includes conversation around what is different with cloud and why you can do something like DevSecOps, where before this definitional capability just didn't exist. So any conversation that I have with customers generally starts with a conversation around the shared responsibility model. At a basic level, this is the value proposition of cloud, right? AWS manages the bottom layers of the stack, so from the concrete floor up to layer 4, the hypervisor. So physical security and HVAC and racking and stacking servers, but also perimeter security around the premises, et cetera. That's AWS's responsibility, and we maintain security of the cloud. However, what we're really talking about today is mostly for customers to be able to extract best practices, including what we do for security of the cloud ourselves, to be able to implement security in the cloud. So one of the big value propositions here is that you can move from a waterfall model to an agile model. And by that, what I mean is that instead of having, let's say, 6 or 9 month or even longer deliverable cycles, where you have a dev team that is building towards a production, and then later after the fact, you bolt on some security requirements, and they need to put that through the gauntlet. That instead you've got this continuous integration, continuous deployment model of these short cycles where you can validate your development cycles as you go, and it's much more iterative. And really, ultimately, this actually becomes a cloud native way of doing work because you're getting IT on demand, which is the value proposition of cloud, right? So instead of having to invest in a huge amount of servers because you want to do some big new compute project, instead you pay as you go, and you can have, as you know, virtually unlimited resources that you get from AWS. And what that means is that you can have these relatively short development cycles, and then you can iterate upon those. And that means that your innovation cycles are a lot faster, that your cost of development goes down, and your likelihood of getting a usable output goes up, presumably.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned, the transition from waterfall to agile, and one of the key features that we see in there is this reduced cycle time. Right, each cycle you push a code change, it goes through the CI/CD pipeline. You have a build artifact, you deploy that into prod or into test, not directly to prod.
Don't stress people out.
Yeah. But how does that look when you're operating in a DevSecOps model? Because that's so far everything I just said there. That's the CI/CD continuous delivery process for code.
Right.
But what you've emphasized how important it is to have security embedded in that process, part of the feedback loop, part of the iteration. So can you give us an example of what that cycle looks like?
Yeah, so part of this is actually looking at what else is different now that we are in cloud. And what it means is that we have infrastructure as code. So this code sample on the slide is a CloudFormation template that you can grab, and it will create a VPC and add an EC2 instance in a single subnet. So this is what we mean by infrastructure as code. And then around that, you can put security as code. And so really, when we're talking about anything that you're spinning up from an architectural standpoint, if you are a developer, you can be constrained by or guided by the kinds of security policies that your security engineers are putting in place. And the way we see it implemented often is that we have development teams with folks who either have a security role or are kind of knighted within the organization to be accountable all the way through the life cycle. And one of the ways that we see this implemented is what I call build a machine. So you make it someone's job to look at the last month of security tickets and say, what did we get here? What can we learn from it? What can we automate about it? And turning that into part of the CI/CD pipeline. So the way that you really, in some sense, when we are talking about DevSecOps, we're talking about security automation at scale. Mm-hmm. And one of the, so Eric Brandwein, who's a distinguished engineer here, has a phrase that if it's not someone's job, then it's just a hope. So part of this, build a machine is to ensure that you have the right mechanisms to make it happen. So it has, like a machine, it has inputs and outputs. And some of those inputs can be human level, but ultimately the process by which it gets mechanized needs to be something that's replicable, that exists over time, that isn't dependent on any one human. And the idea of getting security built in on the code level, on the permissions level, and then all the way through the development pipeline really is something that lends itself towards scaling. Mm-hmm. The idea is that you automate more and more to the point where your security operations center, SOC, is one person on a cell phone because you've automated away a lot of what might otherwise be pain points and friction and security concerns. Mm-hmm. But really what we're talking about is instead of isolating the developer and security communities, having them be working simultaneously towards the goal, which is this kind of iterative development cycle.
Mm-hmm. So if you go back to the slide with the infrastructure as code for a moment.
Yeah.
I think this is another thing I was hoping you can clarify for us, because certainly this is infrastructure as code in the sense that we have a CloudFormation template. By looking at this, we can deduce what sort of resources we're spinning up, and we can kind of spin them down as a unit as well. But we can kind of go into the console. For example, we can apply this CloudFormation template, and then we can go into the console and we can change this thing outside of the CI/CD process as somebody with the correct IAM permissions in the AWS console, right? And that's where I was hoping you can give us some tips about how to deal with this, because that's certainly happened before where I'll go and make a configuration change and it introduces a breaking change that is totally outside of the CI/CD process. And sometimes that introduces a security issue, because if I can do that in a way that breaks the functionality, I can definitely do it in a way where I've introduced a security vulnerability, right? So do you have any advice for how to deal with that kind of scenario?
Yeah, so I think, the conversation starts with security controls. You're going to want to have in place, you referred to, for instance, IAM permissions, identity and access management. So if you're enforcing best practices like least privilege, then maybe you as a developer don't have the capability to escalate your privileges to be able to do something like that. So that would fall under a directive control. Stuff that you're just not going to let people do. So for example, you might want to turn off the capability to create open S3 buckets that can connect to the internet. That's something that you can do as a security decision ahead of time, and then you never have to deal with the trouble ticketing later. Then there's also detective controls, so we could look at when we see that you, the developer, are going out of band and creating resources or altering your infrastructure or whatever that doesn't meet security controls. You could also have alerting on it, so we generate an alert, and depending on the organization's kind of risk tolerance for their developers, they could then require the developer to come in and put in a justification or just kill those resources that the developer has been building up. Yeah. Some folks choose to put in something like a 15-minute timeline so the developer can build out of scope for a period of time, but then if they haven't put in a trouble ticket or justified it within a period of time, then those resources get killed.
Oh, that's very cool. So you can specify a time window for which you can
do enforcement of your policies in very granular ways.
Okay.
And that's one of the cool parts about cloud is that you can get very prescriptive about the tolerance that your organization will have. And with any of these controls, so the third category is responsive controls, which are automation really. And what we're looking at there is taking these feeds and saying, then how do we create automation so that the next time around we know that it simply triggers something to automatically remediate. Of course, the answer with these security controls, if you will, is yes. You're going to have some versions of all of them, but the decisions about these kind of gray areas in terms of what the right thing is to do and what the posture is for your organization are judgment calls, and those are business decisions. Mm-hmm. But I would advocate for them to be made coherently around a particular risk tolerance and security policy. And once you have those in place, this is one way to formalize the way that you think about your security posture. And certainly with cloud, if you have IAM permissions that simply don't allow certain actions to occur, and you can get very granular. So coming back here, with the security as code, you can put in requirements for MFA, you can put in time-based requirements, like you can only access during certain periods of time. So you can know based on your behavioral expectations for anomalous versus normal behavior, you can then actually constrain the universe of possible actions down and really minimize your likelihood of having sort of non-compliant architectures built.
Yeah, but as you're talking through this, one thing kind of jumps out at me is that there needs to be a combination of knowing what tools to use and having a culture that actually uses it, right? Kind of going back to where you started this conversation about, think of it as an analogy to the transition between traditional waterfall development versus agile development. There really is this kind of cultural change that needs to happen in order to make this effective, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there's a couple different elements of that, but one is just the willingness to enforce. And part of this, you can play it out in terms of how it would look. And so using policies as logical formulas is one capability that you can leverage to say, we're just not going to allow this, and this is how I know what I've permitted or not. Automated reasoning is one way that you can verify that you've done what you think you've done. And that's, this slide has Euclid on it in a head nod to the Euclidean constraints of problem solving.
He doesn't look so happy. What's going on?
I mean, that's the picture we have of him.
that was just
thinking
him.
Deep thoughts.
Yeah, this is actually him on a good day, right? You don't want to see him on a bad day.
I couldn't personally attest, but you're right. So a good part of this is actually an organizational change with technological elements. So now that you have security as code, and now that you can implement some of these really granular enforcement mechanisms, the question is really, how do you adjust your organization to actually implement these? And part of this, I think, requires executive sponsorship. So at Amazon, for example, we expect things to be escalated. And our executives are, they answer the phone for security, literally and metaphorically. And I think part of this requires an organization to decide that they are going to answer the phone for security. So this is a good juncture in which to ask your own organization, do you have the right escalation paths? Do you have run books for what happens when something isn't compliant or when it hits an alert? Having the right kinds of listening mechanisms and escalation mechanisms are one element of ensuring that you're doing what you have committed to do. But ultimately, these are decisions that you live out every day. And although we know that there is value added in going from waterfall to agile, there is a cost to it. It can be painful, and I think for folks who have experience in a different model, it can feel awkward to embed security in the way that we're really talking about. But cloud has really enabled the capability to do security as code in ways that are unprecedented. And frankly, we're talking about a bottom line of your organization doing the core mission that it wants to do. So if you're a pharma company, producing R&D that leads to better pharmaceuticals, or if you're the DoD, then producing mission critical outcomes there. And to be able to streamline your innovation process to actually include security as part of how you do business is a better value proposition overall for your bottom line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like no one simple distilled thing to do. This is a full-scale effort that everyone needs to be bought into, from the executives on down to the developers, to business decision makers, PMs, middle managers, everyone.
Yeah, I think that's right. So we're talking about a range of elements here. Security is always a process. There's not like some perfect end state where one day you say, we've got it. And I think that can be uncomfortable, but it's also just the beauty of it. And this is part of doing business. These are business decisions. And security as a bottom line proposition is always the conversation that we need to be having.
Yeah.
So part of this means that we're, by marrying up the security communities, which have traditionally been perceived as a cost, and the development communities, which are trying to push forward as fast and as lean and as deliverable heavy as possible, what we're really saying is that we see a value here that ultimately no one wants to do business if it's not secure, and that we can mechanize that and we can make it part of the way that we live and breathe by using DevSecOps as a model.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we are reaching the end of our time, but I wish it weren't so. I feel like we could be talking about this for a long time, and you're definitely an expert on the subject. So I'd love to chat with you again, but for today,
sounds good.
We're going to sign off, but before we do you have any parting words, any last links you want the viewer to check out?
I mean, just a shout out, there are many DevSecOps-oriented sessions here, including some on the culture of DevSecOps, knowing that that is a conversation that organizations need to have, and structuring some of those important conversations. As I mentioned, this is really an organizational shift with technological elements that enable it to happen.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's it for now. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.